You know, I always thought moving to Lisbon was the perfect way to start fresh. My career as a doctor had been rewarding, but it left me with little time to focus on myself. So, when I found that beautiful old house nestled in the heart of the city, it felt like fate. The house had this charm, this almost magnetic pull that I couldn't resist. The architecture was stunning, with its intricate details and aged elegance. I could already see myself sipping coffee by the window, soaking in the morning sun, and finally finding some peace. The first few days were all about settling and unpacking boxes, arranging furniture, making the place feel like home. Everything seemed perfect, almost too perfect, if I'm honest. But then, on my very first night, I heard something that made me pause. It was just a faint whisper, barely audible, coming from the walls themselves. At first, I brushed it off as the house settling, or maybe my imagination running wild. After all, old houses have a way of creaking and groaning, don't they? But deep down, something didn't feel right. As the days went by, those whispers became harder to ignore. They weren't just random noises anymore, they were more distinct, more purposeful. It was as if the walls themselves were trying to tell me something important. I tried to stay rational, telling myself it was just the house playing tricks on me, maybe the wind or the pipes. But the more I listened, the more I realized that these whispers had a pattern, a rhythm, like a conversation I wasn't quite part of yet. It was unnerving, to say the least. There were moments when I'd be in the middle of doing something mundane like washing dishes or folding laundry, and suddenly, the whispers would fill the room. They seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. I could never quite catch what they were saying, but the tone was unmistakable. It was desperate, almost pleading, like someone was trying to reach out to me from the other side. It sent shivers down my spine, but I tried to push the fear aside. After all, I'm a doctor, I deal with facts, not ghosts. One evening, as I sat in the living room with a book in hand, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They seemed to be surrounding me, closing in, and for a moment, I thought I could make out actual words. But just as quickly as they started, they faded away, leaving me in an eerie silence. My heart was pounding, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in the house. I began to wonder if moving here had been a mistake, but the rational part of me refused to give in to superstition. I tried talking to a few friends about it, but they just laughed it off, saying it was probably the stress of the move or the fact that I was living alone for the first time in years. Maybe they were right. Maybe I was just overthinking things, letting my mind play tricks on me. But every night, as I lay in bed, the whispers would return, faint but persistent, like they were waiting for the perfect moment to reveal themselves fully. And that's when I started to feel truly uneasy. It wasn't just the whispers that got to me. It was the feeling that they were trying to communicate something that I wasn't quite ready to hear. The house, which had once felt so welcoming, now seemed to hold a dark secret, a secret that was slowly unraveling before me. I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. The whispers were calling me, urging me to uncover the truth behind this old house. And as much as I tried to resist, I couldn't help but feel drawn deeper into the mystery that was unfolding around me. After several sleepless nights, I decided that it was time to dig deeper into the history of my new home. The whispers were becoming impossible to ignore, and I needed answers. So, I took a day off from the hospital and headed to the local library, a place that felt safe, grounded in reality. The librarian was a kind, elderly woman who seemed to know everything about the city's past. When I mentioned the address of my house, her expression changed. She grew quiet, almost hesitant, before finally guiding me to the archives. There, buried among the old newspapers and forgotten records, I found the story that would change everything. The house had been the site of a horrific fire exactly 100 years ago. An entire family trapped inside had perished in the flames. As I read through the yellowed pages, I could almost smell the smoke, hear the crackling of the fire, and feel the despair of those who had been consumed by it. The tragedy was well known in Lisbon, a piece of dark history that many preferred to forget. But here I was, living in the very place where it all happened. The articles described the family in detail: father, mother, 2 young children, all lost in what was ruled an accidental fire. But there were whispers even then of something more sinister. Some of the neighbors had reported strange occurrences leading up to the fire, and there were rumors that the family had been involved in something unnatural. The more I read, the more unsettled I became. Could the voices I was hearing belong to these lost souls, trapped in my home, trying to reach out from beyond the grave? My hands trembled as I turned the pages, uncovering more details that made my skin crawl. The house, it seemed, had a reputation long before the fire, a history of misfortune that dated back even further. Previous owners had experienced unexplained deaths, disappearances, and madness. It was as if the house itself was cursed, a magnet for tragedy and despair. The realization that I had willingly moved into such a place made me feel cold all over. What had I gotten myself into? Despite the fear that gripped me, I couldn't stop reading. I needed to know everything, to understand what had happened here. The articles hinted at a cover-up, a rushed investigation that left many questions unanswered. There were survivors' servants who had worked in the house, but their testimonies were vague, conflicting, as if they were too terrified to speak the truth. And then there were the rumors of the house being haunted, of the spirits of the dead family lingering, unable to move on. It was all too much to take in. As I left the library, the weight of what I had learned settled heavily on my shoulders. The whispers in my house were no longer just eerie noises, they were voices, real and desperate, of those who had suffered and died there. But what did they want from me? Why were they reaching out to me, of all people? The questions swirled in my mind, refusing to let go. I knew I couldn't ignore them any longer. The house had a story to tell, and I was the only one who could uncover it. But at what cost? Returning home that evening, the atmosphere in the house felt different, heavier, almost oppressive. The whispers began as soon as I stepped through the door, more urgent now, as if they knew that I had learned their secret. There was no turning back. I had opened a door to the past, and now the spirits were beckoning me further in. I tried to steady my nerves, telling myself that I could handle this, that I needed to know the full truth. But deep down, I feared that the more I uncovered, the more I would become entangled in their tragic fate. As the days slipped by, the whispers in the house became clearer, more defined, and much harder to dismiss. They were no longer just faint murmurs, they had evolved into full sentences, laced with a deep sense of anguish. The voices seemed desperate, almost pleading, as if they were trying to communicate something important, something that I wasn't quite grasping yet. It wasn't just at night anymore. The voices followed me during the day, weaving through the air in every room I entered. It felt like I was living with invisible companions, always just out of sight, but never far from earshot. Each day, I would come home from the hospital, exhausted from the long hours and the emotional toll of my work, only to be met with these disembodied voices. They seemed to grow stronger, more insistent, as if they knew I was the one who could help them. But their words were fragmented, cryptic, like pieces of a puzzle I couldn't quite put together. I would catch snippets of their conversations, bits and pieces of a story that was slowly revealing itself to me. But it was the tone, the sheer desperation in their voices, that haunted me the most. It was clear that they were trapped, reliving their final moments over and over again. At first, I tried to drown out the voices, throwing myself even deeper into my work. But it was no use. The whispers seeped into my thoughts, even during the most mundane tasks, making it nearly impossible to concentrate. I found myself losing focus during surgeries, my mind drifting back to the house, to the voices that seemed to be calling me back. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were trying to tell me something crucial, something that could only be understood by reliving the horrors of that tragic night. The more I listened, the more I felt their pain, their sorrow, and their overwhelming need for someone to hear their story. One evening, as I was preparing dinner, the voices grew louder, more forceful, and for the first time, I could make out specific words. Betrayal, they said, over and over again, as if the very word was soaked in the blood of their suffering. The air around me grew cold, and I could feel a presence standing just behind me, watching, waiting. I turned, half expecting to see someone there, but of course, there was nothing, just the lingering echo of that word, betrayal, hanging in the air like a dark cloud. I knew then that whatever had happened in this house had been far more sinister than I had imagined. The realization hit me like a wave. These spirits weren't just lost souls wandering aimlessly. They were victims bound by the chains of their tragic end. They had been betrayed, and now they were desperate for justice, or at the very least, for someone to understand their torment. But how could I help them? How could I piece together a story that had been buried for a century? The weight of their despair pressed down on me, and I knew that I couldn't simply ignore it. The voices were growing stronger, and their need for resolution was becoming my own. It was as if the house itself was a living entity, feeding off their anguish, and now I was a part of it. The following night, I found myself unable to sleep, the voices louder than ever before. They no longer whispered, they spoke directly to me, their words clear but still disjointed. They spoke of fire, of betrayal, of a darkness that had consumed them all. I could feel their presence in the room, their cold breath on the back of my neck, their sorrow seeping into my very bones. I tried to respond, to reach out to them, but my voice caught in my throat, paralyzed by fear and uncertainty. It was as if the house was testing me, pushing me to the edge, waiting to see how far I was willing to go to uncover the truth. As the hours ticked by, I realized that there was no escaping this. The voices were not going to let me rest until I understood their story, until I uncovered the truth behind their suffering. But with each passing day, the line between reality and the supernatural blurred, leaving me questioning my own sanity. Was I really hearing these voices, or was the house driving me mad? The fear gnawed at me, but so did the need to know more. The voices had become a part of me, and I couldn't turn back now. There was something terrible waiting to be discovered, and I was the only one who could bring it to light. What had once been a peaceful refuge had now become a living nightmare. My beautiful home, with its charming old-world architecture and promise of serenity, was now a place of fear and dread. The whispers that had once been soft and almost ignorable were now an unrelenting presence, growing louder and more insistent by the day. They weren't just in the walls anymore, they were everywhere. I could hear them in the creaking of the floorboards, in the rustle of the curtains, even in the hum of the appliances. And it wasn't just the voices. No, the house itself seemed to be coming alive with a malevolent force I couldn't explain. Doors would slam shut on their own, even when there wasn't a breeze to account for it. Objects that I had placed down just moments before would move as if by some invisible hand. I'd find picture frames turned upside down, books pulled from shelves, and once I came home to find every light in the house flickering ominously. Cold spots appeared in random places, chilling me to the bone, even in the middle of summer. It felt like the house was trying to communicate with me in every way it knew how, using every tool at its disposal to get my attention. And it was working. The spirits, or whatever they were, became more aggressive, more demanding. They began to call me by name, their voices echoing through the halls, sometimes soft, almost pleading, other times sharp and accusatory. They wanted something from me, something I wasn't sure I could give. My sleep, already fractured and restless, became nearly non-existent. I would lie in bed, eyes wide open, listening to the cacophony of voices and noises that filled the house. The once comforting silence of the night had been replaced with an oppressive, suffocating atmosphere that left me on edge, teetering on the brink of panic. Exhausted and emotionally drained, I started to question my own sanity. I'm a doctor, trained to deal with the physical, the tangible, the explainable. But there was nothing rational about what was happening to me. I tried to tell myself it was just stress, maybe some kind of delayed reaction to the trauma I'd seen in the hospital. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. The house had a hold on me, a grip that tightened with each passing day. It was as if the spirits were drawing me in, pulling me deeper into their world, and I couldn't escape. Leaving the house seemed like the most logical solution, but every time I thought about it, something stopped me. It was as if the house itself wouldn't let me go, as if there was an invisible tether keeping me there. I felt an inexplicable connection to the spirits, a bond that defied all reason. I couldn't just walk away, not without understanding what they wanted, not without uncovering the truth that they were so desperately trying to reveal. And yet, the more I stayed, the more I felt myself slipping, as if the line between their world and mine was beginning to blur. I tried to reach out to the spirits, to communicate with them, to understand their pain. But every attempt was met with an overwhelming surge of emotions: fear, anger, despair that left me reeling. It was as if the house was alive with their torment, and I was just another victim caught in its web. The thought of leaving everything behind, of abandoning the house and its tragic past, haunted me. But so did the thought of staying, of becoming just another lost soul trapped within its walls. I was caught in a terrible, unbreakable cycle, and I didn't know how to escape. As the days turned into weeks, the house became a prison, and I was its prisoner. The whispers, the voices, the unexplained phenomena, they all pointed to one undeniable truth. The spirits were not going to rest until I understood their pain, their betrayal. They needed something from me, something I couldn't yet comprehend. But with each passing day, the cost of that understanding grew heavier, and I feared that by the time I figured it out, it might be too late. I was losing myself to the house, to its dark history, and to the spirits that haunted it. And yet, despite it all, I couldn't leave. I was bound to this place, to this mystery, and I knew that whatever came next would change everything. Determined to find some kind of resolution, I knew I had to dig deeper. The surface-level history of the house wasn't enough anymore. The voices, the chilling events, they all pointed to something darker, something hidden that hadn't yet come to light. I needed to know what had truly happened in this house to understand the full scope of its tragic past. So, I reached out to a local historian, someone who had dedicated their life to uncovering the buried secrets of Lisbon. When I told him where I lived, his reaction was a mixture of concern and intrigue. He agreed to meet me, and what he revealed sent shivers down my spine. The historian began by confirming what I already knew about the fire that had claimed the lives of the family. But then, he went further, delving into details that had been left out of the official records. The fire hadn't just killed the family, it had also taken the lives of several servants and workers who had been trapped inside the house that night. The tragedy, it seemed, was far greater than I had imagined. And yet, there was something more sinister lurking beneath the surface. The historian spoke of whispers, not unlike the ones I had heard, of foul play, of a suspected arson that had been quickly covered up. As he continued, a pattern began to emerge. The house, he explained, had always been a magnet for misfortune. It had changed hands multiple times before the fire, each owner meeting a tragic end: suicides, unexplained accidents, disappearances. It was as if the house itself was cursed, feeding off the misery of those who lived within its walls. The fire, he suggested, was just the culmination of decades of darkness, a final, violent act that sealed the fate of all who had lived there. And now, it seemed, that darkness was reaching out to me, pulling me into its web. The more I listened, the more I realized that the voices I was hearing weren't just the family's. No, they were the voices of all the souls who had perished in that house, each one crying out for justice, for closure, for an end to their torment. They had been betrayed, perhaps by someone they trusted, and their spirits couldn't move on until the truth was revealed. But what was the truth? And how was I supposed to uncover it when it had been buried for so long? The weight of their despair pressed down on me, and I began to feel the enormity of the task ahead. I left the historian's office with a heavy heart and a mind full of questions. The house wasn't just haunted, it was a place of deep, unresolved pain. The spirits weren't just lost. They were angry, desperate for someone to listen, to understand, to help them find peace. And somehow, I had become the person they were looking to for that help. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that helping them wouldn't be as simple as uncovering the truth. The truth itself was dangerous, tangled in a web of lies and deceit that had been carefully constructed over the years. Back at the house, the atmosphere was even more oppressive than before. The whispers seemed to know that I had learned something new, something important. They grew louder, more persistent, as if urging me to keep digging, to keep searching for the answers they so desperately needed. But with each new revelation, the danger grew. I could feel it in the air, in the way the house seemed to close in around me, in the way the shadows seemed to move just a little too quickly out of the corner of my eye. The spirits were counting on me, But I was starting to fear that uncovering the truth might come at a cost I wasn't prepared to pay. And yet, I couldn't stop. I had come too far to turn back now. The spirits were relentless, their voices filled with a sorrow so deep it was almost tangible. They needed justice, or at the very least, acknowledgement of the wrongs that had been done to them. And as terrifying as the prospect was, I knew I couldn't abandon them. I was tied to this house, to its dark history, and to the souls that haunted it. But as I prepared to dive even deeper into the past, a nagging fear began to take root in my mind. What if uncovering the truth meant that I too would become a part of the house's tragic story? The spirits were no longer content with mere whispers. They demanded my full attention, and they weren't going to wait patiently anymore. It started with flashes, visions that would come to me in the quiet moments when I least expected them. I'd be sitting in my living room or brushing my teeth, and suddenly the world around me would shift. I'd see the house as it was 100 years ago, engulfed in flames, the heat scorching my skin, the acrid smoke filling my lungs. The screams of the family, the servants, the workers, they echoed in my ears, desperate and terrified. And then, just as quickly, the vision would vanish, leaving me gasping for breath, drenched in cold sweat. These visions weren't just memories, they were something far more disturbing. They were the spirits' way of showing me what had happened, of forcing me to relive their final moments over and over again. And with each vision, more details would emerge, faces twisted in fear, hands reaching out for help that never came, the crackling of the fire as it consumed everything in its path. But there was something else, something that stood out among the chaos, a shadow, lurking in the background, almost hidden, watching as the flames devoured the house. It was a figure barely visible, but its presence was unmistakable. The spirits wanted me to see it, to understand that this wasn't just an accident, it was something much darker. The more I tried to make sense of what I was seeing, the more the visions intensified. They became more frequent, more vivid, as if the spirits were growing impatient with my progress. They needed me to uncover the truth, to expose the shadowy figure that had orchestrated their demise. But the closer I got to understanding, the more the house fought back. It was as if the very walls were alive, trying to keep the secrets buried, to protect whoever or whatever was behind the tragedy. Objects would fly off shelves, windows would shatter, and the cold spots in the house became unbearable, seeping into my bones, leaving me shivering even in the warmest rooms. I began to fear that the house itself was trying to destroy me, to keep me from uncovering the truth that the spirits so desperately wanted to reveal. But despite the fear that gnawed at me, I couldn't stop. I had seen too much, felt too much, to turn back now. The spirits were relentless, their cries growing louder, more anguished, filling my head until I thought I might lose my mind. They showed me more of that shadowy figure, that dark presence that seemed to be at the center of it all, but always just out of reach, always hidden in the corner of my vision. And with each vision, I felt the darkness creeping closer, wrapping itself around me like a cold, suffocating shroud. It was clear that the spirits wanted me to expose the truth, to bring the dark history of the house to light. But every time I tried to delve deeper, to push past the fear and uncover what really happened, something held me back. It was as if the house was alive, a malevolent force that would stop at nothing to protect its secrets. And the more I resisted, the more aggressive the spirits became. They weren't just showing me visions anymore, they were physically pulling me into their world, dragging me into the nightmare that they had been trapped in for a century. The line between my reality and theirs was becoming dangerously thin, and I was terrified of what might happen if it broke completely. The pressure was unbearable. I could feel the spirits' desperation, their need for justice, for someone to finally hear their story. But I could also feel the house's resistance, its determination to keep the truth hidden, to protect the dark forces that had caused so much suffering. I was caught in the middle, torn between the living and the dead, between the past and the present. And the more I tried to fight it, the more I realized that I was running out of time. The spirits were growing impatient, and the house was growing more dangerous. The only way to survive, to bring peace to the souls trapped within those walls, was to uncover the truth before it was too late. But deep down, I knew that doing so would come at a cost I wasn't sure I was willing to pay. The night it all came to a head, I could feel the tension in the air as soon as I stepped inside. The house was alive with energy, buzzing with a dark intensity that made my skin prickle. The whispers, once scattered and fragmented, had become a cacophony of anguished cries, swirling around me in a terrifying storm of sound. I could hardly think, hardly breathe, as the voices filled my mind, pushing me to the brink of madness. They weren't just whispering anymore, they were screaming, begging, demanding that I listen, that I finally face the truth. It was as if the house itself was reaching out to me, pulling me into its twisted embrace. As I moved through the house, the shadows seemed to deepen, to grow thicker and more menacing. I could feel them pressing in on me, closing the distance as if they were alive and had a will of their own. And then, in the corner of my eye, I saw them, the spirits, manifesting for the first time in physical form. Their faces were twisted in agony, their bodies contorted with the pain of their final moments. They weren't just ghosts, they were something much more terrifying, something that had been twisted and deformed by their endless suffering. They reached out to me, their cold, clammy hands brushing against my skin, leaving me frozen in place, paralyzed with fear. They led me slowly and deliberately to the very room where it had all begun, the heart of the house, the place where the fire had first ignited. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and burning wood, and I could almost see the flames licking at the walls, hear the crackling of the fire as it consumed everything in its path. The spirits surrounded me, their voices rising in a deafening crescendo, urging me to see, to understand. And then, in the flickering light of a fire that wasn't really there, I saw the shadowy figure that had haunted my visions, now fully visible, standing in the center of the room, its eyes burning with a malevolent light. The realization hit me like a blow to the chest. This was the one who had betrayed them, the one who had caused all this pain, all this suffering. The spirits wanted justice, but they didn't just want the truth to be revealed, they wanted vengeance. They wanted to drag this dark figure down into the depths of their torment, to make them suffer as they had suffered. And somehow, in their twisted logic, they had decided that I was the key to making that happen. I could feel their anger, their hatred, boiling over, and I knew that they weren't going to let me leave this room, this house, until their vengeance was complete. The figure in the center of the room turned towards me, its eyes locking onto mine, and in that moment, I knew that I was in terrible danger. The house had claimed many souls before me, and now it wanted mine. The spirits were pulling me closer, their cold hands wrapping around me, their voices echoing in my mind, drowning out my own thoughts. I tried to resist, to pull away, but it was no use. I was trapped, caught in a web of despair and anger that I couldn't escape. The walls seemed to close in around me, the air growing thicker, heavier, as if the house itself was swallowing me whole. I fought with everything I had, but the spirits were relentless. They wanted me to join them, to become part of their endless suffering, to share in their pain. I could feel their despair seeping into my very soul, their anger consuming me, until I was no longer sure where they ended and I began. The darkness closed in, and I felt myself slipping away, my consciousness fading as the spirits pulled me deeper into their world. The last thing I heard before everything went black was the sound of their voices, still pleading, still crying out for justice, for vengeance. And then, there was nothing, just cold, suffocating darkness. When the police arrived the next day, they found the house eerily quiet, its windows dark and lifeless. There was no sign of me, no trace of what had happened that night. The only thing they found was the faint sound of whispers echoing through the empty halls, like a ghostly reminder of the house's tragic past. And somewhere, deep within those walls, a new voice had joined the chorus, a voice that would never be heard again by the living, but would forever haunt the house, just like all the others who had come before. The house had claimed another soul, and the cycle of suffering continued, unbroken and unending.